Hello, and welcome back to the No Contest Off Tour podcast, where we take you behind the scenes to the new Stab and RedBull Media House series. I'm Tyler Brewer from the Swell Season Surf podcast, and we are again joined here with director and show host of No Contest Off Tour, Ashton Goggins. Ashton, where are we heading for this episode?
We're headed to Neverland, to Fiji. Cloudbreak, Tavarua.
Fiji. Oh, dream. That is my dream to go there. And you got to go there.
Yeah, this was my first trip to Fiji, and it's always been sort of the top of the list as far as like fantasy surf trips, and it lived up to every bit of its expectation.
That's crazy. So like, first, like, it's a long trip to get there. How do you get to Fiji? Like from the US, what's the route that you got to take?
Fiji now is surprisingly easier to get to than you might imagine. And I was baffled at how quick you could actually be in the water at Cloudbreak. For Australians, it's like a 4-hour flight, and they're almost in the same time zone. And for me, flying from LA, there's direct flights either from Los Angeles or from Honolulu that range from, I think, about 6 hours to about 10 hours. And from Nadi International, you can get on a boat and be in the water at Cloudbreak in about an hour and a half.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, so it definitely gave me a new appreciation for the whole like swell, strike, Cloudbreak sort of surfer. I think there's like a certain type of surfer that has developed over the last, say, 10 years who they always have their eye on that zone. And now I completely understand why.
So how did it come about for this episode? Was this like planned out in advance, or was this more of a strike mission type of thing?
We knew we wanted to do Fiji the whole season, and we had been sort of loosely planning a trip with Julian as we were in production for the other shoots. And for this episode, we had just finished shooting in Europe, and we're planning on going to Brazil, and this purple blob popped up, and Tavita Nukilau, who's an Australian-born Fijian, his dad's from one of the islands in the south and called Kundavu, and Tavita hit us up and was like, hey, it looks like there's going to be a moment where it could be like real deal outer reef Cloudbreak, which was not what I had in mind. I was, because I think that people have this conception of Cloudbreak of being that wave, of being a monster, being this fucking perfect XXL dream sort of cylinder. But it's that exact same wave when it's 2 foot. And that to me is what makes that area so special, is that it's the same, the wave stays the same no matter how big it is. It's the most perfect wave from 2 feet to 25 feet on the planet. And as someone whose comfort zone is very firmly under 15 feet, I was real nervous going into the trip. And honestly, I didn't know what to bring. I packed a 7.6 thinking that I was like just laughing with a board that big, and wish that I had at least another 1.5 feet, if not 2 or 3 feet on the front of my board. And we'll go back with exactly that equipment at some point to attempt redemption. But yeah, to answer your question, we wanted to go to Fiji because I think that there's a lot of sort of misconceptions about Fiji. I think a lot of people still think that Cloudbreak and restaurants are private and that they're off limits unless you stay at Tavarua Island. And if they don't realize the ins and outs of how that sort of went down, as far as the 2 decades of exclusivity and the legal fight around opening up the reefs there. And from the outside, I think it looks like a real, like, sort of negative conflict. And I was pretty excited to go and sit and talk to John Roseman, who, for people who don't know who John Roseman is, I think he's probably the most barreled human to ever live. He's one of the co-founders of Tavarua Island Resort, and he's lived on the island of Tavarua since, I believe, the late 80s, early 90s. I know that the resort opened the same year that Endless Summer 2 released in 1995, I believe.
Yeah, 94, 95, yeah.
That was my first surf movie, really, as a kid. I remember being, 12 or 13 years old and seeing that for the first time. And at that point, Fiji and the Cloudbreak section of that movie defined what, in my mind, a perfect wave looked like, and what a truly like paradise. Let me say that again. And what a real like South Pacific paradise island looked like. And I just remember that scene of Kelly and Jeff Booth and Tom Carroll and those guys walking around the island in 45 minutes or whatever it was. Yeah. And just thinking like, I hope someday I get to go there. And when they greenlit this project, the first person that I called was Julian. Julian was off tour, and he's, one of my favorite surfers out there. I always think back about the heat between him and Taj and Kelly Slater in, I think, 2015. And just it being the dreamiest surf contest conditions you could ever have, just like roping 6 to 8 foot Cloudbreak. And Julian and I have, known each other for a long time. Julian used to be a longboarder. Or at the very least, Julian is an exceptionally gifted longboarder as well as a shortboarder.
There's no shame in that.
And we had that shared, interest. But Julian and I have spent a bit of time on tour together. And for him, I think that it was a bit eye-opening going into this project and it not just being about being in the event. If it was, if he was usually, let me say one more time. I think it was a very different trip for Julian because normally he'd be flying in for either a CT event and staying at Tavarua, or he would be coming in for maybe a swell and just filming at Cloudbreak and restaurants and then flying out, the day after the swell. And for this trip, we were fully embedded with Tavita and Yuri and this whole crew of local Fijians who were so generous with their time and took us to all the different villages and showed us around where all the boatmen live and how, as Cloudbreak and restaurants have opened, these guys have been able to develop their own form of like village surf tourism so that surfers who are coming, they don't have to stay at the Marriott or at some like luxury hotel nearby. They can stay right in the villages at these homestays and be taken care of by truly the friendliest and kindest people I've ever been around, who are also the most comfortable people you'd like to be around in the heaviest situations that you can put yourself. And so we got to meet a guy named Abo, who most people who've ever spent any time on Namotu or Cloudbreak will have met, who's like the biggest guy in Fiji, who's the exact person you want, like fishing you out of the water. And, if you're getting into a pretty tricky situation at Cloudbreak and to see what village life looks like in 2022, and especially after spending the last 2 years locked down in a place like Los Angeles and spending a lot of time in the US in cities, to see what real like rural village communal life looks like and feels like, and what it's like to be a little kid running around a village barefoot in the most supportive, warm, like little culture that I've ever encountered. It was such a surreal experience for Julian and I. And one that I don't think a lot of surfers who've just come and had that sort of luxury resort boat out to Cloudbreak experience would have gotten to feel. And for me, it was really special.
It's nice to be able to pull back the curtain and see beyond Cloudbreak and restaurants in that sense. It's something like, when you think of Fiji, that's all you think about. And for a lot of our listeners should be aware, there's actually so much more to Fiji too,
Yeah, there's tons of other waves. Admittedly, the season that we were there, it was pretty hard for us to go anywhere but Cloudbreak restaurants because it was massive. But there's every variety of setup that you could ever imagine for any level of surfer visiting. There's beach breaks, there's really friendly sort of reef passes that look like Malibu. And then there's the scariest waves on the planet if you want it. And you can do that trip any number of ways. For me, having seen all the options, I'm hard pressed to think of a more enjoyable experience than being hosted by the villages and spending time with them and having them sort of give their side of Fiji. It felt like going back in time. And to me, that's like a dream scenario on a surf trip that you don't get to have anymore, where you feel like you're able to go back and experience what surfing might have been like before the explosion of the internet, before most sort of destination international surf zones were developed and sort of not exploited, but at the very least, like industrialized almost. It still feels like you're going on an adventure going to Fiji nowadays.
Did let's talk about the history a little bit of this discovery of Cloudbreak, particularly, and restaurants, in Tavarua, basically, because it is really interesting. There, for me, I've always thought of Fiji. There's a Surfer magazine cover with Kevin Naughton about to jump off a boat, to perfect Cloudbreak, and that image has always stuck in my head. That, and also the 1987 OP Fiji Pro, that was an invite-only contest specialty ASP event where Tom Curran won, actually. But but it was like, but that was it really until like you said, Endless Summer 2. But it had been a privatized reef, basically, and I was hoping maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit about that and how that changed.
Yeah, so from my understanding of the sort of origin story or the discovery of Cloudbreak and restaurants was that Steve Ritter was driving through Fiji on a sailboat in 1978 and discovered restaurants, and then later saw Cloudbreak but never surfed it. And then Dave Clark, who is John Roseman's partner in Tavarua Island, came shortly after in the early 80s and saw Cloudbreak, perfect, surfed it, named it, the whole thing. What's unique about Fiji is they have this very specific organization of fishing rights to all the reefs that are managed by the individual villages nearby. So each village has its own section of the reef that they're tasked with fishing and managing and, sort of tending to. And their rights are exclusive. So each village doesn't sort of infringe on the other villages' areas that they're fishing. And when Dave and John negotiated the lease on the island for Tavarua Island Resort, the fishing rights came with it. So it meant that surfers couldn't anchor and set up at those reefs. They were exclusive to anyone that was staying at the islands. Because of that, you think about the period of time that Fiji was discovered as a surf destination. During that sort of golden 20-year decade, or let me say that, you think about the period that Fiji was sort of discovered and that Cloudbreak and restaurants in Tavarua were pioneered. It's right in the middle of that 2-decade-long golden era of sort of surf discovery that starts in the 70s with Central America and Bali and ends in really the early 90s, mid-90s with the Mentawais. And Fiji, less than any of those locations, to my mind, was sort of developed and exploited like a lot of those areas during that period of time. You didn't see outside investors coming and like building surf camps all over Fiji. And that was largely because those two waves, because of the lease that Dave and John had negotiated, were off limits to anybody that was coming. So how do you sell a surf trip to someone if they can't surf the best two waves on the island? So it always, to my mind, remained like the ultimate high ticket, like paradise that you were going to pay and, have this like exclusive experience at Tavarua. So because of that, Fiji's surf culture was also somewhat slow to develop from a local sense. And just in the last 10, 15 years, there's been a real burst of actual local Fijians taking up surfing and surfing all the other waves nearby. But one of the big challenges is getting kids out to the outer reefs and those waves. They require a boat and someone to, that's comfortable on the reefs driving. And so slowly that infrastructure has been developed largely through the opening of Cloudbreak in 2010 through the legal dispute and the surfing decree that the Fijian government put into place. And then the ability for the local villages to create their own services that they can bring the kids out with. And nowadays you see a really sort of synergistic, cool environment that now when you visit Fiji today, the ecosystem and the lineup is super harmonious. Most of the businesses if not all, that are running charters out to Cloudbreak and restaurants are run by locals who at one point worked on the islands.
Mm.
And they've been able to create a system where they can pick up people at the airport, put them up, take them out and surf, and work with the guys on Tavarua and on Namotu and all the other islands to create a really sustainable, like enjoyable, like really low bad vibe environment. It's one of the coolest crowds that I've ever surfed in, and one of the coolest like shared experiences that I've had with a really diverse group of surfers, all having the best day of their lives.
So if you're going to Fiji, what should you bring?
A helmet, an impact vest.
Betadine.
Yeah. Fiji's definitely like a choose your own adventure. I would say I would bring surfboards designed for your absolute highest performance surfing in the most critical waves that you're comfortable in, whatever those are. I would bring a really good like SPF hat and shirt and rash guard and whatever you want to deal with the sun, because it's brutal and you're on the boat all day with the reflection coming off the water and it could get pretty ruthless. Polarized sunglasses. If you're surfing Cloudbreak over say 6 to 8 foot, I would say that a helmet is not a bad idea. If you're surfing restaurants and you're not comfortable surfing over really shallow reef, I would definitely wear a helmet. We saw maybe 4 or 5 injuries in a matter of 45 minutes at restaurants, including me getting ripped through the cheese grater and filleting my legs with, I have black like tiger stripes on the back of my thighs from the reef at restaurants. And just be prepared for it to not be like it is a dream wave, but it is one of the most powerful deep water reef passes that holds swell that size. I mean, people always compare it to Chopu and Pipe when it's big, but it feels more like a big sunset to me, like a big perfect sunset, like an open ocean, just freight train of a wave as it gets bigger. And yeah, if you have the right equipment, if you have a big board that you're really confident on, I think it's still, even though I had a shocker on the big days, riding and trying to get in on a 7.6, I think that it is the most user-friendly big barrel on the planet if you have the right board. And now I know what that board is, or what that,
what it should be. So like a 9.0,
it's not
9.0 quad, maybe.
Oh, when we were flying in, we got a text message from Tavita, and he's like, "It's looking like it's going to be outer ledge on Thursday." And I said, "Oh, cool. I've got a 7.6." And he goes, "I don't know. I just pulled out a 9.6 and a 9.2." And Julian immediately got in his car and drove 3 hours outside of Merriweather to track down an 8.6 because he didn't have anything bigger than an 8.0 that and in that board he'd only ridden once. Huh. And he thought the 8.6 was going to be enormous the whole time. He's like, I don't know why I even brought this thing. First wave of the big day on the 8.0, he snapped it in half and then spent the rest of the day on an 8.6, and all of a sudden is completely interested in charging big waves. Like fully had his big wave debut in front of Billy Kemper and Koa Rothman and Jojo Roper and all these guys. Like pretty impressed at him having a crack and getting a few of the waves of the day on a big paddleboard that he'd never even, had under his arm until a few days before that. But yeah, bring a big board. You will not regret it.
Reef booties?
I didn't wear reef booties and I paid for it dearly. If it's big, you're sort of clomping around on these big coral heads that are like these big brains. It's not super sharp at Cloudbreak, unless you get into certain little like patches. You can sort of make do without them. If you're fucking around at restaurants, you need anything you can get. It depends, if you feel comfortable clomping around on reef, go for it. But reef booties will probably save your life.
So let's talk then about some of the other characters that you got to interview for this episode. Who were some of the people that you were not aware of before going there, that all of a sudden became really important to you and to this episode?
So we got to spend time with Shay Slaughter and his dad, who've owned a place called Cardo's in Dennerelle Harbor. That's like the place that if you're celebrating the best day of your life surfing, it's been the like spot for the after party for years. And Shay, during the big day that we had at Cloudbreak, by far caught the best waves of the day. And for him, he was a kid that grew up, you know, looking at Cloudbreak and not being able to surf it and dreaming about having a crack when it gets big. And to see him finally get that like dream day that he had in his mind was pretty special to witness. And then just to see his whole program, you know, they have this beautiful farm about 10, 15 minutes from the docks to get out to Cloudbreak, and maybe 20 minutes from their restaurant, where they grow a lot of the citrus and they raise a lot of the livestock, and they just have this like very thoughtful approach to sort of farm to table dining. And it's an incredible vibe at their restaurant. It just feels like the coolest local, like old school cocktail bar that you could ever sit and celebrate your wins and losses and lick your wounds. And then getting to spend time on Tavarua with John Roseman, and, you know, to get to know a guy who's lived sort of a Peter Pan existence from the outside to most surfers. I think he's got to be, as far as like guys who've done it better than anybody else, who've made surfing at a high level and getting barreled the center of their lives, I think you're hard pressed to find people that can match him pound for pound, barrel for barrel, besides maybe Mike Ho. And that's an impressive like thing to be able to claim, you know, and it's he's lived an honorable existence as a surfer.
It's amazing. I mean, for a guy who grew up in Laguna Beach too, you know, and he, like you said, is probably one of the most, he's probably spent more time in the barrel than anyone in human history, potentially.
Yeah, he has to.
That's funny to think about. And one of the things we kind of touched on once before the recording this was like, I asked, does that diminish the tube for him? Does that like take away from, you know, by having perfect waves all the time, you know, does that like make it any less exciting or fun?
Yeah, you always fear that, you know, if too much of a good thing would have it lose its luster. But seeing Roseman get blown out of like 10-foot pits for 4 or 5 hours with the biggest smile on his face, like almost shaking like a little kid after waves, it makes you realize that you can never get barreled enough.
So there was always this question I would always pose people. Like I would ask, would you rather be one of the best surfers in the world and be able to surf any waves and have diversity of waves? Or would you rather just be an average surfer who had perfect waves every day? And I think we now know the answer to that question is have perfect waves every day.
Especially that wave, because there's very few waves on the planet that do exactly the same thing, no matter if it's 2 foot or 20 foot. And to be able to have that variety, to have a perfect wave at, you know, how sliced up any way you want it throughout the year. I can't imagine a better way to spend your life. And it's one of those things that you know, sitting and hearing what that felt like for him to make that decision to go, I'm going to be uncompromising about this. This is going to be my life. That to me is like a fucking flex on the universe of being like, I grew up so far from this world, but I'm going to put myself at the center of this one because it has everything that I could ever want. And as much as I think it's easy to just say like, oh yeah, he just stayed and got barreled his whole life, he'll tell you just as quickly that it was just as big of a draw to be there because of just how friendly and warm and kind and generous and cool the Fijian people are. I can't think of friendlier people that I've ever encountered. Why wouldn't you want to spend the rest of your life getting barreled around people like that? Like, that's heaven. And so good on him for it. And he's the blueprint for a surfing life well lived, I think.
So let's now dive behind the scenes here. What were some adventures that you had while making this? We touched a little bit on like your reef rash and whatnot, but I'm curious, like what do you want like our listeners to kind of know that you had to go through to make this episode?
A lot of nerves. This episode was definitely the scariest one as far as the forecast and the conditions and the just sort of scramble for it. I got to finally experience what that's like for a big wave guy. You know, I think that I've chased, you know, fairly decent swells for projects before, and we got really good waves at a lot of the locations that we shot for this series, but hands down, it was the first time that I've ever seen like mindlessly perfect 20-foot bombs roll through a reef pass. So it was like a real like pinnacle trip for us. And for me, the biggest adventure of it was seeing Julian just like fucking say, yeah, sure, I'll have a crack. And how much fun he had when it got big. It definitely was like it added a new depth to his repertoire in my mind. And I think he really enjoyed it. He seemed very interested in trying to go get huge barrels after that experience. He said it was that he saw the best waves of his life and caught the biggest, got the biggest barrels that he'd ever gotten. So it's, he's one of my favorite surfers on the planet and has been for like 20 years. It's cool to see someone with that much experience behind them still have like a peak experience. What about
put our listeners in your shoes getting caught inside at Cloudbreak? So, let's just like, because it does look perfect, but let's like give some of the reality here.
Yeah, I would put Cloudbreak over maybe 8 foot in the top 5 scariest lineups to be caught inside, just because of how much water is moving down that reef. I think that for people that have seen like Chopu or Pipe, a lot of times the wave is the focus of the energy. At Cloudbreak, it's the whole lineup shifting, and a wave would come through that would carry what felt like the whole fucking ocean, like 400 or 500 meters down the reef. You'd get dragged, and you'd see someone get held under and pulled like full tombstone, like 75 or 100 yards underwater, and come up looking as scared as I'd ever seen surfers. At places like Mavericks or Jaws, the fear is a 2-wave hold down. It's not one wave dragging you for fucking 500 yards. It's a very short, intense beating, and then you pop up and hope there's not another wave there. At Cloudbreak, you were just hoping that the wave would fucking let you up. And once you pop up, you're so far in, it's very difficult to get back out without a ski. And a lot of times you're getting lagooned and they're having to come around and grab you. And during that lagooning, you're standing on these big, like, brain reef, like, let me say, when you get caught inside, you suddenly find yourself trying to sort of skip between these big mushroom head brains of coral that are about 3 to 4 feet wide and that collapse underneath you as you fall on them at times. And so you're falling into like little deep ravines as like 10 feet of whitewater is coming at you with like zero water in between you and the reef. And so you're just trying to like absorb the impact and try and be carried over the reef at a certain elevation to keep from being like bounced like a bit of a ball into the lagoon.
Hey, listeners, Cloudbreak is open ocean wave basically. So you're not near any land, and that I think is the difference from a lot of other spots. It's totally out in the middle of the ocean, and that's why you're getting dragged so far.
Yeah, there's no interference. There's nothing to break up the energy as it hits that reef. It just keeps moving forward straight towards restaurants, honestly. And as you're getting dragged, you're on the convergence of this deep water channel and this really shallow reef. And so all the energy is just getting sucked and pulled down and along the reef instead of onto the reef, like at waves like Chopes, where you just get blown, in, and then you just go around. Here you're getting pulled and dragged at the same time. And yeah, when I came back, I called Nate Fletcher. I was like, fuck, I wish you would have told me that Cloudbreak was heavy. He's like, what are you talking about? I told you to pack a 9.6. That doesn't tell you that it's heavy enough? I was like, I fucking should have listened to you. Holy shit. But yeah, when I go back, I will go back with an impact suit, with inflation, with a helmet, and with the biggest board that I'm comfortable trying to sort of navigate around a lineup like that. Because it was a lot bigger playing field and a lot broader lineup than I was expecting.
I can't imagine what it's like trying to line up there too, because there's no landmarkers to really set yourself up.
And there's no more tower. The tower that the WSL used to build each year for the event, or that they used to maintain for the event, washed away a few years ago. So there's just like a little platform that once it gets over like 6 feet, you can't see because it's just white water.
Wow.
Even the back of it is taller than that. So it's very complicated trying to triangulate, especially when it starts to move to that outer ledge. And yeah, you would get caught inside and fucking swept through. And I think everyone at the end of the first session, when it was big, was feeling pretty lucky that no one had gotten really seriously hurt. And we motored straight into a restaurant session, which is a much smaller wave, but a much, much more dangerous reef and a much shallower reef. And in a matter of like 40 minutes, it was just like full carnage. Heads getting split open, broken shoulder, my adventure through the reef. And what was really amazing was seeing the guys from Tavarua just fully boom, get into action. Like these are the guys that weren't even staying at the resort, but they were there to grab them, get them medical service. They always, for the most part, have emergency doctors on the island that can handle, most situations that people will get in. But yeah, it was amazing seeing the emergency team just go, boom, we've got this, and sort out a guy that was like concussed, bleeding from his head, like not in a good way. And
bleeding from the head, I would never imagine happening in a good way, really, but
yeah, not in a good way.
So let's talk costs. If I want to go to Fiji, what am I looking at in terms of expenses here?
The luxury options are
luxurious,
top dollar, but not as expensive as you might think. You can get rooms at, say, the Marriott for $300 or $400. Tavarua, you rent, for the most part, you do a blocked out week, and I don't know what those run depending. I think it changes season to season a little bit, and for the most part, Tavarua has been booked by the same people that have been coming back for 25 years, and they have their windows blocked, and they do it each year. But if you're just going and wanting to do the full like local host route, I think you can do it for cheaper than people probably imagine, and you're putting money back into the community and into each of the villages. So that's the way I would go. I would go reach out to Vita and Yuri and some of the locals and let them know you're coming. Have them connect you with Abo and the crew in Nabila Village. See if they have any openings at some of the homestays, and just let them take care of you, because you won't find better hands to land in than those guys. And it's a real experience staying in a village in Fiji. It feels exactly like it sounds, like a village in a South Pacific paradise full of people that have a real vested interest in keeping it that way.
Kava ceremonies. Did you partake?
It's funny. We didn't do any like fancy big like kava shoot, because I feel like that's the one thing that everyone's seen.
Well, Endless Summer too. Tom Carroll, doing a little shot out of a coconut, and then like.
And Roseman sitting in the crew with Kelly.
Yeah.
I remember sitting there. I remember seeing like, oh, that's the guy that owns the island. Kava is really, really, really interesting as far as the taste goes. It tastes like you're drinking. They always say it's like dirty dish socks.
Yeah.
Or,
dirty dish water.
Water. Yeah.
Dish socks. I've never heard of those.
Or dirty socks and dirty dishes. Let me say that over. So everyone always says that it's like dirty socks or like dishwater. And That's a little bit harsh. It's a root, it tastes, I think people that have taken a turmeric shot or, or ginseng. Yeah. It takes a little bit to get used to, but I would argue that it's a large part of what makes Fijian culture so sort of low key and friendly and warm is that it's not only is it like a bit of a sedative and an antidepressant, has like a real calming property that if you drink too much, you just end up going to sleep. So you don't see people getting wasted on kava and like causing a scene. It's a bunch of, they'll share kava together and relax after a day of work and, slowly wind down. And what I thought was really interesting was just, as I was doing research, seeing how big of a boom there's been in kava as an export from Fiji, and how many kava bars have opened up around the world, especially the United States. Of course, because people keep referring to it in headlines as nature's Xanax, and Western culture loves a medication. But it's a really it's a very interesting experience, the whole process, and it's not as official of a thing as people might expect. My first kava experience was legitimately in like a parking lot of just like a random hotel that I stayed at the first night. And there was a bunch of food trucks out just doing like sort of barbecue and different like meats out on a grill. And they asked me if I wanted to drink some kava, and they just mixed up a batch of kava for me to share with them. And we just sat and had kava together for like 45 minutes. And it was just this nice sort of shared beverage that you sat and they poured you some and you drank it and then they drank some. And it just felt like this very like conversational experience. Not unlike wine or anything else, but it was far less psychoactive and much more mild and enjoyable than I was expecting.
Now, I had always heard when they make kava, the original way was to chew it and then spit it out, and that's what you would drink, actually.
Oh, I didn't realize that was like that you would chew it and then process it.
Yeah,
that was the actual process.
It had an activation with the saliva. That was like somewhere, I think I read in like Happy Isles of Oceania.
Yeah.
Paul Thoreau, I think. But yeah.
I tried to bring some kava back.
How did that go?
And
over
I had
with
this
customs?
like 2 kilo bag, and they're like, you can only bring 1 kilo. So I had to like wink and nudge to the guy and go out and pour half of it out for him in a bag and then go through, and
That's awesome.
But I think that people be surprised that you can probably go out and find kava near where you live today, and that it has become a really important export for the communities there, and a big crop that hopefully will bring some economic sort of energy to the islands.
Well, there you go. What sort of resources, where can people find information on going to Fiji and Tavarua? What sort of call outs do we need to give here?
Swing through Cardo's in Denarau Harbor and talk to Shay. Reach out to Tavita Nukilau. Tavita and his really close friend Yuri work with Nabila Village, sort of organizing homestays, and they're actually developing a little surf camp with them on a piece of land that they've leased from Nabila, so that they can sort of start to develop their own whole sort of surf camping experience with Abo and the whole crew. So I'm really excited to go back and to see those guys build their own reality for themselves. But yeah, talk to those guys. They'll dial you in.
And one last, any takeaways for listeners going to Fiji? Any other advice that they should know?
Bring bandages and antibiotic cream that has been shown to be effective on staph infections.
Well, there you go. Bring bandages, people. And everyone, you can find this episode on RedBull TV. Definitely check it out. It's amazing. The waves are pumping and it is sick. And yeah, like you said, Julian Wilson is charging and it's really cool. It's a great episode. So listeners, go check it out. It is now streaming, and We will catch you next time to discuss another location that we go to for No Contest Off Tour.
Our next undisclosed location.
Shh, it's a secret.
Thanks, Tyler.
No problem, Ashton. We'll see you all soon. Take care.